into a book called Above the Skyline. So he has also co-authored a book on HIV, and prior to his current work at LGBT, he was at Yale University. He said this should suffice as an introduction, but obviously there is much more to Graham Reid than what I've told you. So without wasting much of your time, and because our topic is pretty flexible, let me not repeat it. So Graham will tell you what he wants to talk to us about. Graham,
thank you very much. Thank you. Great. Thanks very much. I'm very pleased to be here this evening in my old hunting grounds here at Wits University. And I thought what I'd do this evening is talk a little bit about my current work, but to draw mostly on my ethnographic field work that went into my PhD thesis, and looking at the idea of culture and tradition and how that plays itself out in the context of the debates about same-sex marriage here in South Africa, and particularly a series of workshops that were organized by the National House of Traditional Leaders. Because I think that those particular set of workshops, by looking kind of quite closely at the rhetoric of those workshops, it gives some insight into the ways in which culture and tradition are framed in relation to debates about LGBT equality. And then I'll talk a little bit about, or we'll have an opportunity to talk about the implications of that, and in relation to the current work that I'm doing at Human Rights Watch, particularly in relation to the human rights claims of LGBT people in sub-Saharan Africa. So as a sort of broad overview, that's what I'm planning to do this evening. And just to frame what is quite a microscopic study in terms of a bigger picture, is that increasingly there's been a significant development within the context of the United Nations Human Rights Council in the debate about traditional values. It's an old debate about cultural relativism, but it's recently been given new impetus. And in 2009, a resolution was adopted. This resolution was primarily sponsored by Russia, and this in support of traditional values. And the resolution, in a sense, is quite modest in its requests, which was for a workshop in which, and I quote, an exchange of views on how a better understanding of traditional values of humankind underpinning international human rights norms and standards can contribute to the promotion and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms. So this seems like a fairly innocuous request, but of course the invocation of traditional values is often one that is used to oppose the rights of LGBT people, and indeed the rights claims of women. And so it's a resolution that has and should produce some alarm bells. And there's been quite a lot of pushback and resistance to this resolution, but there was a lot of support for it from Eastern Europe, from African countries, and from the OIC, and regions where economic insecurity and political instability make this concept of traditional values particularly appealing. The Holy See has been very proactive in its support for this resolution, and of course traditional values has resonance with the family values rhetoric that is so common in the US. And my thinking is that this rhetoric of traditional values represents a new alignment of the opposition to sexual and gender minorities within the body of the UN. So it's a way of, instead of negatively opposing new resolutions about sexual autonomy and gender equality, it's a way of proactively framing that opposition in terms of a positive set of values. We support traditional values, we support family values. And so it's a kind of realignment of that opposition in different kinds of terms. So just that's the sort of broad picture, and now I want to focus in on the South African situation, and to say that nowhere is the paradox between the ideals of the South African Constitution and lived reality more apparent than in public contestations about gender and sexuality. And in this respect, public debates around same-sex marriages have been particularly vocal. Now, many of you will know that more than any other single issue, cases relating to sexual orientation have appeared before the Constitutional Court, and this has generated widespread public deliberation within South Africa. And gay and lesbian equality has come to occupy an ambiguous and paradoxical place. On the one hand, it's seen as a litmus test for the success of constitutional democracy, in some ways emblematic of a human rights-based social order. This is an unpopular issue, but it's specifically protected in the Constitution, and so it takes on that kind of status. And on the other hand, in public rhetoric, homosexuality is cast both as untraditional and specifically as un-African and as un-Christian, a dangerous threat to the social fabric. And because gay and lesbian equality is not widely supported, it is also one of the key moral barometers that tests the gap between the ideals of the Constitution and popular opinion. So sexual orientation is a constitutional provision with profound connotations that are both positive and negative. So in this paper, I'll look at a series of hearings that were held under the auspices of the National House of Traditional Leaders to gauge public opinion on same-sex marriages. And these hearings provided a forum for the articulation of negative ideas about homosexuality that was sparked by this prospect of same-sex marriage. And questions of gender and sexuality were subject to vigorous debate. And in these debates, tradition was pitted against modernity, while the participants raised questions about the nature of democracy, the relationship between public opinion and minority rights. So there were very interesting workshops in those respects because they provided a forum for much bigger debates. And the idea that homosexuality is contrary to cultural norms and moral values, which is the substance of this particular talk, that it is un-African and un-Christian, is a familiar one in the Southern African public sphere. That associations with gay lifestyles are multiple, ambiguous, and paradoxical. And the very idea that homosexuality is imagined as untraditional means that in this context it is also thought of as modern. And this association with modernity is an ambiguous one, encompassing on the one hand the fears and anxieties about the erosion of traditional norms and values, and on the other a set of aspirations and expectations associated with modernity. And it's this paradoxical position of homosexuality that I explore in this paper, specifically how it manifested in the discussions around same-sex marriage. So I draw on these two, what I call ethnographic archives. One is my own doctoral research, as I mentioned, which took place in small towns and urban peripheries and rural areas, mostly in the Mpumalanga province. So Ermelo was my research center, and there was towns and villages around that. And this research took place, started in 2003 and extended into 2005. And my research actually focused on a network of gay hairstylists and their associates working in these small towns and rural areas. And the second archive is this record of public hearings, some of which I attended, others of which I had access to the transcripts of. And so I've done an analysis of the public interaction at these hearings. And it's important to point out that these hearings were held several months before the very widely publicized hearings around same-sex marriage that everyone's familiar with. But these were organized by the National House of Traditional Leaders and took place prior to that. And they were in the heart of the constituency of the National House of Traditional Leaders, in the rural hinterlands of KwaZulu-Natal, the Free State, Mpumalanga, Northwest, Limpopo, and the Eastern Cape. So clearly a small, often haphazardly organized minority does not realistically pose a threat to the foundations of a social order imagined in terms of culture, tradition, or religion, and yet homosexuality features very prominently in these kinds of debates. So I'll start just with a description of the first workshop and how that played itself out. It was a workshop that took place in Batklas, the small town of Batklas. I don't know if anyone is familiar with this town. It's famous for its hot springs. And in this town there was a kind of enactment of a same-sex marriage, mostly because the audience didn't have a clue what was meant by same-sex marriage or what the proposal was. So in order to demonstrate that, a representative from the National House of Traditional Leaders took the hand of a charismatic Christian pastor who was on the stage to demonstrate to the audience what a same-sex marriage would mean. So there was this brief enactment of a same-sex marriage on the stage until the pastor, which was visibly uncomfortable by this, kind of withdrew from the setting. So that kind of framed this initial presentation, and it happened to be on Valentine's Day, the 14th of February 2005. Now the reason for this rather touching if bizarre scene was that the small crowd who had gathered for the hearing did not understand what the meeting about. So it was this discussion, what is same-sex marriage? And Chief Mabandla, the local chief, outlined the purpose of the hearing, and I'll quote. He said, there is a law which does not exist amongst us black people that says same-sex couples have a right to marry each other. And he asked the audience, as Swazi people, do you have such a thing in your culture and tradition? Of course, in the circumstances, it was a rhetorical question, but nevertheless, it was answered by the audience with a resounding no.